In September 1932, 11 men hung 850 feet above Manhattan. The real story, however, was not born from fearless workers, but from a carefully crafted plan in a Rockefeller Center memo. There were no safety nets, no harnesses, just a camera, a beam, a fall waiting below, and a paycheck that could end in tragedy. The photograph became famous. Its dangers, the deaths, and the staged nature largely erased behind nostalgia and corporate profit. What was hidden behind this slice of Americana, and whose courage was used to build the legend in the first place? On September 20th, 1932, the Rockefeller Center publicity office left nothing to chance. In the weeks before the famous photograph, the department created internal memos outlining a coordinated media strategy to highlight the nearly finished RCA building. These papers contained more than just a date or time. They included which news outlets would get access, who would handle on-site details, and which photographers were allowed onto the steel itself. Scheduling notes recovered from the Rockefeller Center archives show that 3 photographers, Charles Ebbets, Thomas Kelly, and William Leftwich, were issued press passes that morning. Each had to sign in at the construction gate, their names recorded by a security clerk on a roster now yellowed with age. A memo, dated just days before the shoot and marked with the Rockefeller Center letterhead, instructed the publicity staff to prepare the highest beam on the 69th floor for staged photos. The wording left no room for improvisation. Coordinate with foremen for chosen crew. Irish and Mohawk men preferred for visual effect. Prepare lunchboxes and props. Make sure the beam is clear for photographers at 10:30 sharp. The document made it clear that this was not a sudden act of bravery, but a carefully managed publicity production designed to generate headlines and assure investors that the project was on track, even as the Great Depression hung over Manhattan. A second document, a press pass log from the same week, lists all credentialed media for the event. Ebbets, Kelly, and Leftwich signed next to their outlets: Acme News Pictures, Wide World Photos, and International News Service. Their signatures were accompanied by a note: beam access granted for publicity photos only. No other personnel allowed. This level of organization was rare at the time, but Rockefeller Center leadership knew what was at stake. With unemployment near 25%, every positive headline counted. The photo shoot was part of a larger publicity effort that included staged scenes of workers napping on girders, tossing a football, or pretending to ride stone blocks lifted by cranes. Behind the paperwork, the publicity team worked like a news bureau. They carefully selected workers based on appearance, ethnic background, and willingness to participate. Drawing from Irish immigrants and Mohawk ironworkers known for skill and reputation on high steel, the memo's instruction to use men from Kanawaki and Hell's Kitchen crews was a deliberate choice to display diversity, strength, and resilience, qualities the public wanted to see during economic hardship. Every detail, from lunch boxes to the exact timing of the shoot, was arranged in advance. These documents, preserved in Rockefeller Center archives, give a rare look into Depression-era publicity. They show an image not created by a fleeting act of courage, but by a blueprint for corporate storytelling. The next morning, the photographers climbed the steel skeleton, press passes in hand, to capture what would become a legendary photo. Charles C. Ebbets stepped onto the beam with his camera slung over one shoulder, pressing past equipment tucked into his jacket. There was no safety rail, no harness, nothing to catch a misstep, only empty air stretching 850 feet to the street below. The morning of September 20th, 1932, brought sharp wind and a view of Manhattan few would ever see outside a postcard. Ebbets was not alone. Thomas Kelly and William Leftwich, the other credentialed photographers, waited their turns. But it was Ebbets' name that would eventually appear in archive credits. Ebbets had experience with stunts and public events, but nothing matched the risk of balancing on a narrow girder while adjusting a large, heavy Graflex camera that required both hands to focus and load glass plate negatives. Each exposure was a gamble against gravity and wind. Decades later, the original negative would crack into 5 pieces in storage. On that morning, the only cracks that mattered were in the steel underfoot. The Rockefeller Center publicity team had mapped out the angles. Ebbets was told to shoot from the east-facing beam to capture the workers against the cityscape. Camera sketches still survive showing the planned positions. The men lined up, lunchboxes dangling, skyline blurred behind them. Ebbets had to crouch, lean, and sometimes lie flat on the steel to get the perfect composition. Every movement was careful. One slip could mean death. The workers posed as, directed, faces calm and rehearsed, while Ebbets worked to maintain balance. There were no safety nets. The only instruction from the foreman: get the shot, and get off the beam quickly. Ebbets's notes, now part of the archives, described the struggle to hold the camera steady in the wind. The photograph that resulted was crisp and perfectly framed, hiding all the tension behind the lens. The glass negative captured not only a publicity stunt, but also the physical bravery needed to document it. Press logs and negative records confirm Ebbets's presence and hint at the organized chaos of the shoot. 3 photographers jostled for space, each trying to produce the front-page image. The final credit went to Ebbets, but the danger was shared by all on the beam. Once the shot was done, Ebbets climbed down, leaving behind a cracked glass plate that would outlast every man on that steel. Who were the men risking their lives for a lunch break in the sky? High above Manhattan in 1932, the men on the beam were part of a much bigger story, built on family networks, community, and the tough realities of survival. Decades before Rockefeller Center rose from Midtown bedrock, Mohawk families from Kanawake, a reserve south of Montreal, traveled south each spring. The journey was familiar. By train to New York, then subway, or trolley to hiring halls along 7th Avenue. 4 men posted job slips in the windows, and word spread quickly through family letters and word of mouth. For many Mohawk men, high steel work was a family trade. Grandfathers and uncles had built bridges across the St. Lawrence River, and sons and nephews now crossed the border to walk New York's beams. The Depression made these journeys more urgent. In 1932, unemployment in North America hovered near 25%, and jobs on the Kanawake Reserve were even scarcer. New York construction companies, desperate for skilled labor, relied on crews with reputations for reliability. By the early 1930s, about half of the city's high steel workers were Mohawk. This dominance was not due to inherited fearlessness, but economic necessity and strong community ties. Recruiters knew where to find experienced men willing to take risks, and the promise of steady pay, often sent home in cash, kept the cycle alive. Irish immigrants followed another well-worn path. Many arrived through Ellis Island in the late 1800s or early 1900s, settling in neighborhoods like Hell's Kitchen or Inwood. Irish workers had long been key to New York's labor force, from digging subways to building early skyscrapers. By the 1930s, ironwork was passed down through generations. Union halls like Ironworkers Local 40 and 361 became meeting points where cousins, brothers, and friends vouched for each other. Jobs were rarely advertised. They were handed down through family or earned by showing up before dawn, ready to work. These networks shaped who worked on the city's highest beams. Mohawk crews often traveled and lived together in boarding houses near the site. Irish workers clustered in familiar neighborhoods, forming tight crews that protected their own. Both groups faced hardship. Irish men were often shut out of higher-paying white-collar work, while Mohawk families endured poverty on the reserve and prejudice in the city. Yet their skill on high steel made them indispensable, even if their names rarely appeared in company records or newspapers. The myth that Mohawk men were naturally fearless became popular, but interviews with descendants and historians tell a different story. It was family networks, shared knowledge, and mutual support that truly made the work possible. Punctuation, that beam for the camera. Dozens more worked unseen, connected by trust and the shared hope that a job high above the city could keep a family going. In the end, the faces in the photograph were not picked randomly. They were the visible edge of a much larger network, woven by migration, financial pressures, and the quiet determination of communities who built New York's skyline beam by beam. Identifying the men having lunch on a skyscraper beam has challenged researchers for decades. With no surviving payroll records or daily crew lists from Rockefeller Center construction, every name tied to a face relies on detective work, part archival, part forensic, and part family memory. Most men remain unknown, but 2 have been identified thanks to careful cross-referencing of photographs, family collections, and union documents. The first breakthrough came with William E. Clark. A faded payroll slip from fall 1932 lists Clark's name among the ironworkers assigned to the RCA building's upper floors. While the slip doesn't mention the photo shoot, it confirms Clark was on site during the crucial weeks. Decades later, his descendants shared a family portrait with documentary filmmakers showing Clark in his work clothes, the same strong jaw and broad nose seen at the far right of the famous image. Historical photography experts, including Ken Johnston of Corbasis, compared the two images side by side. The match was striking down to the tilt of his cap and the set of his mouth. Though no single document can definitively prove Clark stood on that beam that morning, the combination of payroll records, family photos, and visual analysis gives this identification the highest level of certainty currently possible. A second name comes from a different type of evidence. Joseph Echner's family preserved a sepia-toned photograph from the early 1930s, showing him in a vest and work shirt, perched casually on a stoop, with the same relaxed posture seen in the second seat from the left. When digitally overlaid with the B.M. photograph, the features matched: the cheekbones, hairline, even the hands holding the lunch pail. Oral histories from the Echner family recall Joe working high steel during the Depression and his membership in Ironworkers Local 40, placing him in Manhattan at the right time. Again, no payroll or official roster confirms September 20th, 1932, but the visual and circumstantial evidence is strong enough that historians now list Echner as highly probable. Other faces in the photograph have drawn claims from relatives and amateur sleuths, but evidence rarely rises above speculation. Some families point to old letters or union cards, others to physical resemblance in faded group shots. Without definitive records, most identifications remain tentative, marked by researchers as possible or unverified. Rockefeller Center archives hold hundreds of construction photos, but no complete log of the men posing for publicity shots survives. Union records from that era, if they exist, are patchy and often hard to access. Historians caution against wishful thinking. The desire to see a grandfather or great-uncle in the photograph is powerful, but verification standards are strict. Only when multiple forms of evidence, archival, photographic, and testimonial, come together do researchers move a name from rumor to likely participant. In the cases of Clark and Echner, the overlap is convincing, though even these identifications carry an asterisk, strong but not absolute. The work of matching names to faces in Lunch Atop a Skyscraper is as much about the limits of memory as it is about discovery. Each confirmed identification stands on a foundation of documents, images, and family stories carefully weighed for accuracy. For most men, the record remains silent. Their anonymity reflects the realities of Depression-era labor, fleeting, undocumented, and too often forgotten. Yet when evidence aligns, a fragment of certainty emerges from the fog of history, allowing a name to be spoken with confidence, even if not without qualification. Steel beams stretched across open air, slick with dew and dust, with only the wind as company. On the morning of the photo, the men chosen for the beam wore no harnesses, no safety ropes, not even a simple line to steady themselves. The only thing between them and the street below was their own balance and memory of every foothold. Rockefeller Center's construction site, like every skyscraper in 1932, ran without modern safety equipment. No nets were strung beneath the girders to catch a falling man. Hard hats would not become standard for years. Even gloves were a luxury, not a guarantee. The ironworkers wore worn boots, heavy shirts, and caps to shield their eyes from glare, but nothing could stop a fall. The steel itself was unforgiving. Beams measured just a foot wide, sometimes less, and shifted underfoot as cranes moved new sections into place. Gusts of wind funneled between unfinished towers, strong enough to rattle lunch pails and send loose bolts tumbling to the street. Men carried tools in one hand and clung to the girder with the other, moving forward inch by inch. Safety manuals, if they existed, offered little more than common sense. Keep your eyes open, don't look down, trust your partner. There were no checklists, no inspections, no government agency to enforce rules. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration would not exist for another 40 years. Supervisors watched from the ground, sometimes shouting reminders, rarely intervening. The pace of work left no room for caution. Steel had to go up quickly. Every lost hour meant lost wages. If a man slipped, The work didn't stop. His absence was noted. Pay docked. Another worker took his place. The site culture treated risk as routine. Fatal Falls were whispered at lunch, but rarely reported unless a body landed on the sidewalk. Even then, stories focused on delays, not the men. Photographs from the era show men perched on beams with legs dangling, backs to the void, sometimes laughing or sharing a cigarette. The bravado was real, but so was fear. Many kept small tokens in their pockets: rosary beads, lucky coins, folded family photos, tiny comforts in a world where one misstep could end a life. Some carried lunch in battered tin pails. Others wrapped it in newspaper. No one brought a safety belt. It simply wasn't part of the job. The lack of protection wasn't an oversight. It was accepted. Developers calculated risk as a cost of business. Insurance covered worst accidents, but prevention was up to the men themselves. For those who built the skyline, the only barrier between survival and freefall was skill, nerve, and hope that today wasn't the day luck ran out. Official records from Rockefeller Center list 4 deaths during the RCA Tower construction. The Empire State Building, finished the previous year, counted 5. These numbers appear in project reports and newspaper clippings, but they tell only part of the story. In the 1930s, the true cost of a fall wasn't just the bodies, but how little law required employers to pay when tragedy struck. New York's Workmen's Compensation Law of 1914 capped death benefits at $1,000, a lump sum for a widow, a smaller portion for each child, nothing extra for pain or lost years. For many families, that meant a funeral, a few rent payments, then nothing, relying on charity or relatives to make up the rest. Project ledgers show how payments were processed. A worker's name would be crossed out in the payroll book, a note added, sometimes just deceased. Claims were handled by the contractor's insurance agent, who cut a check and closed the file. There was no obligation to investigate the fall or improve safety. Coroners often described accidents as acts of God, shielding developers from liability. The men who died became statistics, their stories reduced to a line in a ledger or a brief city record. Families pressing for more lawsuits or inquests found the legal system firmly against them. A few won extra settlements after years in court. Most received nothing beyond the legal cap. The numbers were small compared to the scale of the work: 4 at Rockefeller Center, 5 at the Empire State Building. But each represented a family left adrift. Counts didn't include men dying later from injuries or unreported deaths. To avoid delays or bad press, lack of safety gear, the push to build quickly, and legal limits on compensation made fatal falls a routine, almost invisible part of the industry. Publicity photos projected strength and progress, but ledgers and laws reveal a harsher reality: lives lost, families paid off, and construction continuing as if nothing had happened. On October 2nd, 1932, a photo of 11 men sitting on a steel beam high above Manhattan appeared in more than 40 newspapers across the U.S., distributed by Acme newspapers and other syndicates. It ran on business pages and city news sections from New York to San Francisco. Editors placed it alongside economic forecasts and stock market updates, a careful choice that paired the spectacle of progress with the hope of recovery. Rockefeller Center's publicity team worked closely with press agents to make sure the image reached as many people as possible. Syndication agreements sent the photograph to the Associated Press, United Press, and International News Service, ensuring that even small-town newspapers could run the picture within days of it being taken. The circulation figures were enormous for that period. The New York Herald Tribune, which first printed the photo, had a Sunday readership of nearly 500,000 copies. Other papers like the Chicago Tribune and the Los Angeles Times picked up the story via wire services, each adding their own captions praising courage and modern achievements. Overall, more than 40 major publications ran the photograph or a version of it in just 1 week. The picture became a topic of conversation, not only in New York, but in towns and cities far away from the skyline it captured. Letters to editors praised the workers' bravery, while business sections cited the photo as evidence that American industry still had the nerve to build upward, even as the country struggled through the Depression. Behind the scenes, Rockefeller Center's developers monitored the publicity campaign with the same precision they applied to steel and concrete. Internal letters from the time show executives counting the placements and noting which papers gave the image prime space. A memo from the advertising department, filed just days after publication, lists the cities where the photograph appeared above the fold, a sign of success in an era when front-page space was highly contested. The memo also mentions early licensing talks as photo agencies started receiving requests for reprints and secondary uses. The publicity team understood the power of syndication. Every new market reached meant another chance to influence public opinion and reassure investors. The photograph's immediate effect went beyond simple brand awareness. In the fall of 1932, with unemployment still near historic highs, the image of men calmly eating lunch high above the city was both comforting and inspiring. Rockefeller Center's backers wanted to project confidence and show that the project was not just surviving the Depression, but growing despite it. The photo campaign was designed to counter headlines about layoffs, bank failures, and halted construction elsewhere. Every time the image appeared in a new city, it carried a clear message. New York was still building, and Rockefeller Center was leading the way. Newspaper records from that week show the campaign's reach. In Boston, the Globe ran the photo with a headline about iron men defying gravity. In St. Louis, the Post-Dispatch paired it with an article about economic optimism. Even in smaller towns, editors found room for the image, often reprinting it weeks later in year-end retrospectives, celebrating American perseverance. The photograph became shorthand for the era's mix of fear and hope. Its placement in the press was as carefully planned as the steelwork it captured. The initial wave of syndication laid the foundation for everything that followed. The photograph was no longer just a record of a publicity stunt. It became a national symbol shaped by the priorities of developers and the reach of Depression-era media. Licensing requests that poured in would soon open a new chapter in the image's commercial life. But in the fall of 1932, its power was in how it filled newspapers across the country with a vision of courage, progress, and determination. By the late 20th century, the photograph of 11 men perched high above Manhattan had grown beyond a symbol. It had become a commercial product. The original glass negative, cracked and delicate, sat deep in the B-Man archive, but the image spread far beyond any storage vault. In 1995, the B-Man archive, along with the rights to Lunch at the Top of a Skyscraper, was sold to Corbus, a photo licensing company founded by Bill Gates. The deal transferred not just a collection of images, but the legal power to reproduce and profit from some of the 20th century's most famous moments. Licensing agreements signed that year opened the door for mass-market reproduction. Poster companies negotiated six-figure deals to print the photograph on everything from art prints to mugs. Royalties flowed steadily, sometimes surpassing the combined annual earnings of all 11 men on the beam. Retailers reported that by the late 1990s, the image ranked among the world's top-selling posters, rivaling pop culture icons and famous paintings in sheer volume. The photograph's path from a Depression-era publicity stunt to a staple in dorm rooms and corporate offices was powered by a network of licensing agents and lawyers. Each reproduction sent a small share back to the archive owners, tracked in royalty ledgers that showed steady profit growth as the image's popularity surged. Contracts included strict rules: no changes to the men's faces, no commercial endorsements, but unlimited runs for home or office decoration. The image became a fixture in catalogs, often stripped of its original context, and sold as a timeless celebration of American grit. Buyers rarely wondered where the money went. The families of the men on the beam received nothing. No royalty checks ever reached Kanawha or Hell's Kitchen. The families of William Clark or Joseph Eckner, whose faces sold millions of prints, remained anonymous. Amid the commercial boom, some distributors tried to highlight the story, offering limited editions with certificates of authenticity or short biographies of the workers. But profits stayed with the rights holders. The B-Man archive, now managed by Getty Images, continued to license the photo to advertisers, filmmakers, and publishers. Each new campaign added another layer of legend, further separating the image from the men whose lives once depended on steady hands and luck. The licensing success highlighted a harsh divide. While archive owners counted profits, the workers' families counted their losses. The men who risked everything for a staged photograph became faceless icons. Their labor turned into a product that filled offices and bedrooms worldwide. The commercial success of Lunch at the Top of a Skyscraper is a reminder that even the most familiar images can carry the cost of exploitation. Profits built on the backs of men whose names and sacrifices were nearly forgotten. Today, skyscraper workers have protections their predecessors could only dream of. Yet in 2004, construction remains one of the deadliest jobs in America, with over 1,000 worker deaths each year. The myth lives on, but so does the danger. When we celebrate progress, we must also recognize the human lives it consumes. Every iconic image hides a price. We are still deciding how much we are willing to pay. When you look up now, what do you see?